Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin this study, I do want to make a couple of clarifications on the last episode. First off, I don't know why I brought up the point of asking why, like, the works of Josephus are not a part of the Old Testament, because the works of Josephus were not written down until after the Old Testament was already canonized. So that was me being a big dum dum. The second point I want to make is that I know I said next time we will look at Genesis 1 and 2, but when I was writing out the notes, just Genesis 1 took me like 6 pages. And the fact that my notes are not like full manuscripts, they're more bullet points, that's a lot. So this is just going to be on Genesis chapter 1. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. So, some goals for today. Basically, what we're going to be doing is examining the theological claims of Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to do that by exploring the context of the ancient Near East. And I also want to make a point of clarification here. I don't know how often I'm going to be doing this, but whenever I'm talking about dates, I'm going to be using the more recent form BCE and CE, which stands for Before Common Era and Common Era. And I know I've used that before in the past, and some people have claimed that that is like an unchristian thing to do because the way that people have talked about dates for a long time was BC and AD, which stands for Before Christ, and Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord. And by using Common Era as a like the notation is somehow working against that, but actually Common Era is much more technically accurate, because the thing is, when you look at history and the way the Gregorian calendar works, which is the calendar system that we use, the year 1 AD is supposed to be the first year that Christ was alive. Essentially, Christ was born in 1 AD, right? That is supposed to be how our system works. It's based around the birth of Christ. The problem is, when historians and scholars have actually looked at dating throughout the last 2,000 years, what they found was that Christ was actually born, according to our calendar, in the year 3 BC, which throws everything off. So rather than just shifting all of our dates back 3 years, scholars just developed a new system that we just call Common Era. So it's more accurate, because to say the year of our Lord is actually inaccurate, technically it's off by a few years. I'm just trying to be more technically accurate. So let's jump in. In the ancient Near East, you have several creation accounts. There are two accounts that are the most prominent. So if you ever take classes on the ancient Near Eastern culture, you're definitely going to encounter these. The two main creation accounts come from Babylon and Egypt, because those are the two main cultural and political powers in the ancient Near East. And the Babylonian account that you may have heard of is called the Enuma Elish. And I'll be going through sort of the main points of that. I'm not going to go over the whole thing. You can easily find the whole thing written out online. And I'm also going to be going over the Egyptian creation accounts. There's essentially four Egyptian accounts. The main ones are the ones that originate from Heliopolis, Memphis, and Hermopolis. But they're all similar enough that I'm just going to be going over like the main points of those. I'm not going to go over each one individually. All right, so the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish goes like this: that before any other creation appeared, the only thing that existed was this chaotic water that was everywhere. And then the gods appeared and they created fresh water and salt water, so they differentiated the two, and that is personified in the goddess Tiamat. And then another god named Marduk, he rose up, he killed Tiamat, he split her into pieces and separated her. So he like created a space within her belly, and the top part of her was used to create a division between the heaven and the sky, and then the bottom part of her carcass is what Marduk used to create Earth, essentially. And then after that, Marduk appointed other gods to various duties. So some of the gods became the planets and the sun and the moon, and other gods had authority over certain stars and constellations. It's not exactly clear, at least to me from what I've studied, if the other gods were stars or if they just had authority over certain stars. And then after all that happens, after Tiamat is killed, we have the separation of the heavens and the seas, then we have the land appearing, then we have all these celestial bodies. Then mankind is created, but mankind in the Enuma Elish is created out of the blood of a fallen god, a god who was killed. And then, in order to relieve the gods of their duties, the newly created humans are then given the role of taking over the duties of the gods. And that is the Enuma Elish in a nutshell. It is much more complex than that, but those are the main points that we're going to use for the purpose of this study. The next account is I guess I'll call it the generic Egyptian account because, again, the aspects of these are present in several of the Egyptian creation narratives, so I'm just going to go over the main points. So, similar to the Enuma Elish, the Egyptian creation narratives involve multiple gods called the Aeneid. I think that's how you pronounce it. And the Aeneid was essentially just a collection of multiple deities worshipped by a local city, such as Heliopolis or Memphis. Each one had their own Aeneid, and each Aeneid had their own function in their own creation narratives. And some of the Aeneids ended up becoming more prominent, so some of those gods became more well known throughout all of Egypt, such as Ra or Osiris or Iris. But there are many, many gods in the Egyptian religion because they all derive from their own separate localities. But the Egyptian creation narratives kind of go like this. So everything begins similarly to the Enuma Elish with these ancient chaotic waters. And then the first thing that's created by the gods is the sun, and the sun held superiority over the rest of creation, and then ground appeared from the water below because the water receded, similar to how the Nile functions, like the flooding of the Nile. That's sort of how the ground appeared in Egyptian creation stories. The stories themselves are not particularly long, and they're much more physiologically focused. So, for example, the Enuma Elish, it does talk about how certain natural elements like the rivers and oceans and lakes and how those things appeared, but it's also concerned about things like the source of morality and wisdom, things like that are more abstract. Egyptian cosmology is more interested in the natural world and how that came about. It doesn't really talk much about morality or anything like that. So now I want to talk about when the book of Genesis was written, particularly the early chapters, because that's what we're talking about today, and also why that matters. So this actually gets a little complicated because Genesis could have been written as early as the year 950 BCE, but the thing is, the stories originate a lot earlier than that. And the reason this gets complicated is the difference between oral language and written language. Written language is something that we tend to take for granted. It's important to know that a written language is still a fairly new thing in terms of human history. At best, it originated in the ancient Near East sometime around 3500 BCE. And when language originated, it was used very different than how language is used today. So the earlier forms of language were used mostly for accounting, so pretty boring stuff, and also keeping track of numbers for tax purposes. Later on, it was used for recording laws and to some extent royal communications. And then later on, it was used to record histories and stories. So all of that to say that it is tricky to nail down when the creation narrative of Genesis 1 was solidified as like an idea and something that people talked about and like where the story originated from, because obviously we can trace back the written part of it, like what's actually written down, to around the end of the first millennium BCE. And that's important because at the time that it was written down, around the end of the first millennium BC, and even within a few generations before that, the Babylonian account of creation, the Enuma Elish, and also the Egyptian creation accounts were pretty well established, and they would have been known to the ancient Israelite and the ancient Hebrew community. And so we really can't discount the possibility that those stories influenced how Genesis 1 is written. So now I want to transition. I want to talk a little bit about language itself, like specifically the Hebrew language that Genesis 1 is written in, particularly the first word. And I touched on this in the last part of this, the intro to Genesis. And the first word of Genesis 1 is Bereshit. Now, Bereshit is interesting in how it's written because of how definite and indefinite articles are used in the Hebrew language. So, just very quickly, you all know what a definite and indefinite articles are. So a definite article is like the word the. It is a definite article. If I were to say to you, yesterday I talked to the president, you would know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the current sitting president, the president. But if I were to say to you, I'm talking to a president using the indefinite article, then you would probably follow up with saying, oh, that's cool, but what president are you talking about? Because I'm not being definite. So here's the thing. In Hebrew, the way definite and indefinite words are communicated is by how the vowel points are used. Now, I'm not going to get into all that, but I will say that Bereshit begins with a preposition, and that preposition is actually indefinite. It's not a definite preposition. Now, why that's significant is because in pretty much every English translation I'm familiar with, the first verse of Genesis starts with in the beginning. It uses a definite article for beginning. The interesting part about that is that in Hebrew, there is no definite article. Literally, Genesis 1 1 in Hebrew is in beginning or in a beginning. It is indefinite. And you actually see that echoed in the Greek Septuagint because Greek is closer to English in how this works. Greek has separate words that are definite articles. So in the Greek, if it was going to be a definite article, the Greek would read in he arche, in the beginning. But that's actually not how the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, in Genesis 1 1 of the Greek Septuagint, it just says in arche, which is in beginning. Now it's actually kind of cool because in John 1 1, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, it starts the exact same way. In beginning, in arche. Not in the beginning, in beginning. And the reason that's significant is because, again, there's a lot of background here, but the way the Hebrew language works, Genesis 1 1 is more like an introductory statement. A similar phrase that we'd be familiar with is something like once upon a time. So Genesis 1 1 is almost like saying once upon a time. And I'm not equating it to a fairy tale. All I'm saying is that the first statement of Genesis is an introduction. It's not communicating an action that took place, which is actually how a lot of people interpret Genesis 1 1. So some people go to Genesis 1 1, they say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and they treat it as though that's communicating an action. In other words, people read Genesis 1 1 and say, oh, the first thing God did was he created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2, right, and the Spirit of God, hovered over the waters. We treat that as like the second part of creation. And Genesis 1, verse 2, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That is actually when the action begins taking place. And the reason I point that out is because Genesis chapter 1 is very similar to the Enuma Elish and the Egyptian creation accounts and other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives that were, less well known, in that the story of creation begins with the presence of this chaotic water. Right. So in the beginning, the waters are there, and then God is beginning his creative process, but he hasn't done anything yet. Right. The waters are not something God created. I just want to emphasize that. According to the Hebrew text, God did not create the waters. And then the first thing God does is he creates light, right? He says, let there be light, and there's light. And then the thing he does after that is he actually creates this space and as a division between the heavens and the seas. Then we have the dry ground appearing. Then we have, all of the other parts of creation. You have the creation of vegetation and the animals. Then you have the establishment of the sun and the moon as methods of determining time and seasons. And then you have humans that are created. So there you see there are some similarities between Genesis chapter 1 and other creation narratives. For one, you have the presence of water at the beginning, right? That is something that is very consistent. You have the creation of space between the waters, and the ground sort of develops out of that. You have the establishment of the celestial bodies, right? Those are created. And one thing I didn't mention, but in the other accounts, the purpose of the sun, the moon, and the stars is to determine things like seasons and dates. And you have something similar happening here in Genesis chapter 1. You have the unique creation of all the different elements, and you also have the creation of humans. So there's a lot of similarities between this and other creation narratives in the culture. And there are very clear similarities. But the thing that makes Genesis unique is how the creation happens, because Genesis makes some very startling claims with its creation narrative. And this is probably where the real core of the purpose of Genesis comes through in terms of what it's trying to communicate. So, first off, Genesis is non mythological. And to sort of explain what that means, I'll reference a video by Christine Hayes when she talks about this. I know I referenced her last time. I'm going to reference her again. And I'll probably keep referencing her because her course is amazing. But Genesis is non mythological because what's different from Genesis and the other creation narratives is that the other creation narratives, they all propose that gods are created, right? They talk about the origin of the gods. A lot of them happen through, birth, or they're simply willed into existence. Genesis doesn't do that. God simply exists. There's no account of where he came from. So that's the first major claim that Genesis 1 makes it very different than the other accounts. Second is that in Genesis 1, God is totally supreme. So in things like the Enuma Elish, the way that creation happens is either through conflict or through some sort of intimate relations with other gods and between other gods. But in Genesis 1, that doesn't happen. God simply wills things into existence. There's no conflict. He doesn't have to fight anyone. So there's no real tension taking place. God is the only being who exists, and he just says this is going to happen, and it happens. And as a result of that, Genesis 1 is strictly monotheistic. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is, that Genesis 1 is completely monotheistic. It doesn't even acknowledge the presence that there could be other divine beings. It is only God, and creation happens only by his divine will and power. Another difference is that humans are elevated in Genesis chapter 1. So in the Enuma Elish, for example, human beings are created from the blood of a fallen god. So essentially, they're kind of the products of death, and then they become slaves to the gods. They have to serve them. In Genesis, that doesn't happen. Human beings are the products of God's divine will, and they're also created in order to reflect his likeness. So they're not made as slaves, although they do have responsibilities. It is not a slave responsibility because their purpose, as stated in Genesis chapter 1, is to fill the earth and subdue it. And that is not something that God did at the beginning. It's not as though God did that at first, and then he's like, well, I'm tired of this. I'm just going to put humans in charge of this for now so I can take a break. No, he gave humans a unique responsibility that even he didn't have. So it elevates the value of humans and their place in the order of creation. And those are just some of the differences between the Genesis account and the surrounding religions, but those are very significant and we shouldn't overlook them because they indicate that there's something pretty spectacular happening here in the fact that this story seemingly originated from within these communities and around these other stories. And that in and of itself is pretty impressive. Which brings me to the next point, which is essentially asking the question, well, what if Genesis borrowed from other religions? And I kind of already answered that by saying it seems pretty clear that Genesis did borrow from other religions in terms of its creation account. There's a lot of similarities. And I just gave really two stories briefly that are similar to Genesis, but there are many others and you can look them up yourself. But let's sort of, throw that assumption out and just ask the question, so what if Genesis borrowed from other stories? Well, my response is, so what? So one of the claims of the church, and this has been a claim for a while, is that all religions contain truth. though not every religion is true. So, truth, capital T, sees its fulfillment and source in Christ alone, who is the one true living God from which all truth derives. So, we believe that other religions do contain truth and maybe contain elements of truth, but that does not mean that those other religions are fully true. So, the notion that surrounding cultures to the Hebrew people from which the story of Genesis comes, that those stories could have elements that are similar to Genesis is really not a startling claim. It actually makes a lot of sense. And again, it doesn't devalue the claims that Genesis makes. Now, some critics might say, well, Genesis chapter 1 is clearly just mimicking the surrounding cultures. It's just borrowing from their stories, therefore, that delegitimizes the claims of Genesis. But actually, that's not the case. Yes, there is a similar backdrop, there's similar elements such as the ancient chaotic waters, such as how planets are treated in terms of their purpose and the stars and so forth. But the actual creation process is really just a backdrop to the real points that Genesis 1 is making. And when you read it in the context, the point of Genesis is really not in the technical details, which is how a lot of Westerners like to read it, and which I imagine you're probably familiar with that sort of interpretation. That the real meat of Genesis is in the specific process of creation, right? Day one, this is what God did, and all these little details. Day two, this is what God did, these are all little details. But when you read it in the context of the rest of the ancient Near Eastern culture, all of that's in the background. That's really not the point that Genesis is trying to make. It's not the technical details, it's the meta narrative. And again, the meta narrative of Genesis chapter 1 is strictly monotheistic. There is only one God, and that God has no opposition. There is no obstacle for him to overcome. There is no conflict he has to engage in. And he is not the result of anything else. He is uncreated. He has no master, and he is eternal. And the second major claim it makes is that humans are not slaves. We are not lesser beings. We are made in the image of God, and that offers us certain dignity and certain value. So now I want to go on a bit of a tangent because maybe this is something that you're thinking about as you're hearing this, or maybe it's something that will come out later as you think about it. But I want to talk about this theory that is the evolution of religions. Now, maybe you've heard of this, but the theory goes like this, that it is assumed that religions evolve from one type to another. And when you look throughout history and you study anthropology enough, what you come to see is that religions evolve from simpler types to more complex types. So there is a popular chart or graph, or yeah, chart that's out there, pretty well known, that essentially makes the claim that all religions have their roots in animism, and then animism evolves into shamanism. Shamanism evolves into polytheism, that evolves into monolatry, then monotheism, and then after monotheism, that evolves into whatever else, enlightenment, atheism, something like that. And so that is the theory of the evolution of religions, that all religions just evolve from one to the other. And so, because of that, we shouldn't be surprised that Genesis chapter 1 makes a very clear monotheistic claim because, well, that's just the natural evolution of religion. So, it's just the natural progression of things. Now, here is one of the main problems with that. And just to be clear, I totally disagree with that theory. I think it makes no sense. I think the closer you examine history, you find that it falls flat on its face. And there's a couple reasons for that. I mean, one, it's just a gross generalization, but it's also patently false. So you might have religions, like specific religions, that sort of change a little bit over time, but for the most part, each individual religion throughout history remains fairly consistent. Like there, you really don't see a transition within a religion from like polytheism to monotheistic, like within the same religion. You don't have that. What you have is new religions appear, old and other religions die out. But there's not always a clear connection between the ones that die out and the ones that are new. They're just different. And yes, there are some cases where you have a transition from animism to shamanism, for example, but that's pretty rare. You really don't see that throughout history. Again, what you see are new religions sort of stepping onto the scene and other religions dying out. But let's assume, right? Let's assume that religions change from one form to another, that you could have a culture that is mostly shamanistic, and you have a new religion that evolves out of it that is something else that's not shamanistic. Okay, let's assume that religions can evolve from one form to another. The second claim that the theory of religious evolution makes is that religions evolve in a line. They evolve from a lesser form into a more complex form. So you have at the very beginning animism, and then at the very end, you have atheism, and they progress gradually from one form to another. Sure, you might have some examples in European history where that happens, where you have a lot of shamanistic religions, and then suddenly you have a lot of polytheistic religions, and then you go on to the next stage. But but by and large, that just doesn't happen. You don't have a transition from one popular form of religion to another popular form of religion. And John Mbiti, who is an African theologian and scholar, he actually talks about this. I'm trying to remember what book it is because I don't have a copy of it, and some of his books are really hard to get a hold of. I believe it's in his examination of New Testament theology, where he challenges this claim and says when you look at African religions, for example, a lot of the time you don't have a development of a more complex religion from a more simple form of religion. He says actually in some cases you have the original religion of a region being polytheistic. They believe in many gods. And then suddenly it transitions into an animism, which according to the theory of religious evolution is a major step backwards. And not only that, but even in the Bible itself, you sort of have this. So, again, in Genesis and really the whole Torah, they are strictly monotheistic. They don't even acknowledge the existence of other gods, like what you have in the book of Judges, and then onto the time of the monarchy, where there's sort of these other gods present. In the Torah, there are no other gods. Even when in the story of Exodus, where you would expect that because Egypt has all these gods, that there's going to be this showdown between Yahweh and these other Egyptian gods, and then Yahweh is going to be declared the real winner. There's nothing about other gods. There is no reference to them. They're not named. They're not talked about. There is only Yahweh. So even the very concept, the very notion that other gods could even exist is totally wiped out in the Torah. It is strictly monotheistic. But then when you get further on into Israel's history, they become monolatrous, that they believe in multiple gods, but Yahweh is the bigger one they have to worship. Now, again, according to the theory of religious evolution, that's the step backwards. You don't go, according to that theory, from monotheism backwards to like monolatry or polytheism. But yet, throughout history, that's actually what you see taking place. And even nowadays, right? Let's not restrict this to ancient history. Let's talk about culture nowadays, right? With New Age spirituality. Well, New Age spirituality is actually very similar to animism and polytheism than anything else. Again, that would be a major step backwards. But getting back to Genesis and why I made that whole tangent in the first place, it was all to say this, that the perspective Genesis has of monotheism is not somehow a natural evolution of religious culture that we should overlook and treat it as insignificant or even take it for granted. Like it is a very clearly marked delineation from the surrounding cultures that doesn't have a good historical or even an anthropological explanation. Like the story of Genesis is so unique in the fact that no culture throughout history, and I mean this very seriously, I've done my homework on this. No culture throughout history has ever exhibited just the appearance of a monotheistic belief. And in fact, the three monotheistic religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all have their roots in the story of Genesis. But you look throughout all other human cultures, you look at Asia, you look at the Americas, you look at Europe, you look at Africa, everywhere you look, monotheism never comes onto the scene. This is the only instance in human history where the idea of one God comes into existence. Now, the closest I've been able to find of anything similar actually did happen in Egypt, where one of the pharaohs tried to eliminate the Egyptian pantheon and set himself up as the one and only god, but that failed miserably. And on that note, I do want to reference Zoroastrianism. So, for those who don't know, Zoroastrianism is essentially the ancient religion of Iran, and it's often claimed that Zoroastrianism is the religion that predates Judaism. Or specifically, we could say that the religion of Genesis 1 is more Yahwehism, because Judaism, as like an established set codified religion, is like with all of its doctrines and stuff, actually comes later. So Genesis 1 is more of a Yahwehism, but that's just getting nitpicky. But the idea is that Zoroastrianism predates Yahwehism. And if you do any study or conversation on this, that's probably going to come out in the conversation. But the problem is that the earliest known existence of Zoroastrianism is actually around 600 years after the earliest known origins of Genesis. So if Zoroastrianism or Yahwehism predate one another, like if either one predates the other, it would actually be Yahwehism predates Zoroastrianism. And at the very earliest forms, like if you want to even go back further than that, the farthest back you go with the origins of Zoroastrianism would actually be pretty much the same time that Yahwehism develops. So you really can't claim that Zoroastrianism predated Yahwehism, and so Yahwehism just developed out of Zoroastrianism. Like that's a bit of a dubious claim. Another claim that's made is that Zoroastrianism was the real first monotheistic religion, and that's why some people claim that, oh well, Christianity and Judaism, well, they just borrowed from Zoroastrianism. It's like they just sort of grew out of it. But that actually doesn't make a lot of sense, because when you look at the claims of Zoroastrianism, like at the heart of it, they're a lot different than the claims of Christianity, and they're a lot different than the claims of Yahwehism that we see in the Torah. And also, Zoroastrianism really isn't a monotheistic religion. Like it's more monolatrous, because you do have like one supreme being, but you also have lesser divine beings. Like you have one being that is the perfect personification of all that is good, and you have another that is the perfect personification of all that is evil. So maybe we get the idea of Satan from Zoroastrianism. So tying all this off, it actually is a plausible explanation that the concept of one God who created all things actually finds its source in a divine revelation, which is the claim that Genesis makes in the story of Abram. And again, we shouldn't take that for granted, although I think a lot of people do, because we just sort of assume that religions evolve, even though, as I've explained, that's kind of ridiculous. So, wrapping all this up, in conclusion of Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 does have several things in common with other religions of the time, but it also differs significantly from those other religions. And those differences are where I feel the true claims of Genesis 1 are being made. And that also leads to the next point of the conclusion, which is that interpreting Genesis 1 literally and focusing on the technical aspects of it is problematic for a couple reasons. First off, you are forced to make pretty problematic claims. Because the way Genesis 1 is written, like I already mentioned with the language, you would have to claim that matter is co eternal with God. But also, by reading Genesis literally, it's problematic because it forces you not just to accept weird theological claims, but it also forces you into a position where you have to ignore the cultural context around which the origins of Genesis stem from. And so you actually end up ignoring pretty substantial theological claims and statements that Genesis 1 is trying to make. And so, in a bit of an ironic twist, the people that always want to interpret Genesis chapter 1 literally as a way of sort of preserving the value of Genesis actually end up devaluing the claims that Genesis 1 makes by just ignoring all the context involved. And I will add on this. If you want to hold a literal 6-day creation, as I said in the last episode, I think that's fine. Like I'm not trying to force you into a position where you have to accept, 13 billion year creation time. You can have a literal 6-day creation, but you can't just read Genesis 1 in a literal manner with all the technical details and have that be your source of that view. So that's going to do it for this episode. I know it might have been a little bit of a slog going through Genesis chapter 1, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions you might have or things that you wish I would have talked about, but I didn't. Like, I know I didn't get into like all the details of each individual verse, but you can find lessons on that in other places. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to look more at the background and how the background can influence our interpretation of the text. So, with that being said, if you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, leave a comment, be sure to subscribe, share with all your friends, and I will see you next time.